And so this is the default interface that you're going to see. Let me move this capture status maybe down here. This is the default interface that you're going to see when you open After Effects. It's kind of like all of our other Adobe interfaces. I can resize windows if I want to. I can move windows around to different areas. But usually I'm just going to stick with the basic interface. We also have the workspace option. So if you move some stuff around, if I like put this over here and then I want to reset, I can just go to Window, Workspace, and Reset Default. And then you can also save your own workspaces, just like any other Adobe program. We're going to get started with a very simple composition. So I don't have, usually with After Effects, we actually have some footage. Footage is like something that we've either shot on video or created in After Effects or made in Adobe Illustrator. So usually when you're starting an After Effects project, you're going to be starting from footage that you've created somewhere else. But we're just learning After Effects, so we're going to start with a new composition. So I'll click on New Composition here, and then this is where I'm going to set my composition settings for the first time. So again, normally these settings would be set by whatever your footage is. So if you made an animation that's 24 frames per second and 1920 by 1080, it will notice that and it will use those properties or those settings when it creates a composition. But we're creating a new composition, so I'm just going to call this my main composition. And it already has the HD preset selected, which is great. I'm going to stick with that. But I'm going to change to 24 frames per second because that's what we've been working with in Animate. And I can also just change the frame rate right there, but you know, there's a setting. So a couple other things that I might want to play with. There's a background color. I'm going to stick with black, but if you want to change the background color of your composition, you can do that here. You can also change the duration. So I'm not sure actually what the assignment, if it has like a specific duration. Let's check. I think like probably 10 seconds is fine, but let's just make sure. Okay. Yeah, so there's no real requirement, so I'm just going to go with 10 seconds. And we can always change the duration later if we want to. So when I create my composition, we're going to see a couple of things change. One is we have this new composition here in our project window. Our project window is basically like our file system. So we have a list of all the footage that we have there. If we create new footage, we'll see it in here. We're not really going to be using this a whole lot right now as we just go over the basics. But when we add more footage later, we're going to bring that in. Hey, Ralphie, if you're going to sit like that,
I'm sorry.
I don't like to tell people what to do, but if it's too distracting to me and to other students, then I am going to have to ask you to sit normally. If you can't sit normally, you can sit out in the lobby for as long as you need to. That's fine. But please just try to not be a distraction. Thank you. Okay, so we have our main composition. Our composition window is the big window in the middle. This is where we're going to actually see the graphics or whatever we're working on. Our timeline is this window down here. And this is where we're actually going to do most of the editing. In After Effects, we're mostly going to be editing with the mouse. We're not going to be using like our stylus or our drawing screen as much. You might be comfortable with that and you might want to use that, but I'm probably going to be using the mouse most of the time. There's also a contextual menu over here on the right, and you'll see that this changes depending on what tool I'm using, what window I'm in, different presets that I'm going to be using as I create my composition. So that's kind of like the main different interface components. We'll start to actually make a simple animation, and as we make that animation, we'll see some of the other properties and ways that After Effects organizes our content. So I'm just gonna make this right-hand window a little bit smaller, and this one as well. And I'm gonna make my timeline a little bit bigger. And we probably won't do this today, but one thing that I often do with this interface here is I'll change the layout so that I have more than one viewer here. But for today, we're just going to stick with one viewer. Okay, so let's actually add some content to our page, to our composition, and we'll look at some of the ways that the timeline works as well. So I'm just going to go to layer and create a new layer. And I'm going to create a solid layer. So this is just like a big block of color, essentially. I'm going to choose a nice green color. I don't really know why, but I'm just choosing a random color. So I'll choose this light green color. And if I click this button, it's going to make it the size of the composition. If I'm making like a background or something like that, that would make sense here. But you can make it larger or smaller. You can change the width and height. And then we're just going to add this down here. And now we have a new layer. So we'll talk about the properties of that in a second. Notice how in our project window up here, we now have this new solids folder. So this new layer is footage. Even though it's just like a block of color, it is technically footage. And so anytime we add new footage, we're going to see stuff get added into our project window, and we can organize that in various different ways. We can also change the name of this. So if I guess I have to right click on it and click rename. I can rename this background, or whatever I want to call it so that I remember what this is for. When I double clicked on it, I was trying to change the name, but I accidentally opened the layer itself in a new window, which is not really what I want to do. So I'm going to get rid of that and stay in my composition window. But you can double click on any layer to go in and edit that layer in its own window if you want to do that. But let's go back to our main composition window. So now we have a layer. We're going to add a lot more layers as we add more stuff. But for now, let's take a look at the timeline for a second. On the timeline here, so on the left, I have my layers, and I have like layer properties, which I can animate, which we'll look at in a second. On the right, I have the timeline. And this shows me how long this layer is actually playing for. So right now, it takes up the entire duration of the animation. If I hit play with the space bar, we just see that green the whole time. I can change these two like gray bars with the blue edges, can change the way that I see the workspace. So if I drag this one like that, you can see that the timeline is expanding. So instead of just seeing seconds, I see frames. So this doesn't change the animation itself. It just changes what I see in the window as I'm editing. And I can also move this around. So you can see if I move this, I'm moving between the different times in my timeline. So that is just the view. It doesn't change the way it plays back or anything like that. This larger bar down here actually changes the way it plays back. So if I move this down here, it's just going to loop that section. So again, this doesn't change the actual animation. It just changes what I see when I preview the animation. And I can move this around as well. If I want to move over here and look at this area and do some edits, then I can expand this again. So then this little red bar here is the layer. I can change the color of this if I want to. It'll kind of assign random colors as I create new layers. And then I can move this around. If I just drag back and forth, I'll move this around. So if I want my green color to come in later, I can move this over. And we can see the beginning of this layer now starts there. I can also increase the size, duration of the layer. So if I hover over the left and right edges, then I can change the beginning and ending points of the layer. And then I can move it around in time and change where the footage, where that content appears in the animation. Okay. So I think that is all of the basics. You guys probably know a lot of that stuff already, so it may be a little bit boring. But now I'll go over keyframing, which is also probably a little bit of review. But hopefully it'll be good to review our keyframing. So if I want to keyframe different components of my footage, I can open this little arrow right here, and that'll show me the properties of this layer. So this layer has a transform. A transform is kind of like a term for like the dimensions of the layer. So things like the position, the scale, rotation, all of these things that we can transform or make transformations to change the dimensions of this layer. So in here, I have a whole bunch of different properties associated with this layer. And you can see, you know, I have the position. So if I move the X position, I change the horizontal position of the layer. If I move the Y position, that changes the Y position of the layer. Then with scale, I can scale the layer in and out. And X and Y are typically locked together, but I can scale just the X or just the Y if I turn that little lock off. And then I can, you know, reset it, although I have to turn the lock off. And I'll reset it. And then I can rotate. So I can rotate, using degrees. So that'll do like, you know, you'll see a little bit of rotation. Or I can actually rotate like an entire 360 rotation. So the rotation has two numbers. The first number is like one rotation, and then the second number is degrees around the rotation. And then we have the opacity, which is just setting how transparent the layer is so we can see through to what's behind it. So let's make a very simple animation. I'm just going to keyframe the opacity and sort of fade in the animation or the background. So, you know, just to create sort of a basic simple animation. So I'm going to move the workspace down here like this. And actually, I'm going to move this guy first. So I'm going to change this to 4 seconds, and I'm going to move this down so I can focus on just this part of the animation. And then I'm going to move my playhead up to 1 second. So the playhead is the little blue line, and this just determines where we are on this timeline. So I'm going to move the playhead to here. And if I want to add a keyframe, I just click on this little stopwatch next to the property that I want to animate. So I'm going to click the stopwatch here, and I'm going to set the opacity to 0. So now I want After Effects to fade in this layer over a second. So I'm going to move my playhead up to 2 seconds, right there. And so now, this is a mistake that a lot of people make when they first start learning After Effects. You might think I should click the stopwatch again. If I click the stopwatch again, what happens is it actually gets rid of all of my keyframes. So that's an important thing to be aware of. The stopwatch doesn't create a keyframe. The stopwatch essentially says to After Effects that I want there to be keyframes on this property. So I'm going to undo that. And now if I want a new keyframe, I can actually just change the value. And After Effects will see I'm on a different frame and I'm changing the value, so it knows that I want to make a keyframe. So if I change the opacity to 100%, it's going to make a new keyframe there. If I want to just add a new keyframe, I can click this keyframe button here, but it'll add it at whatever the value is I have right there. And so usually when I'm adding a new keyframe, what I'm actually going to do is just change the value and let After Effects add the keyframe for me once I've already added keyframes to this property. Okay, so now we can actually see this animation occur over time. There we go. So we're fading in, so that's very exciting. And basically what After Effects is doing is it's taking those two numbers and then it's doing some pretty simple math to say what should the opacity be at each frame if I go through these numbers. So if we go here, if I just like go up by 1, you can see the opacity changes to 4. So it starts at 0, and then it changes to 4, and it keeps going up in various increments. So really all After Effects is doing is it's looking at the first number for that keyframe and the second number for the next keyframe, and it's doing some math to figure out what number should it be at this frame. And we're going to look at a little bit more detail about how that works in the second part of class, but that's pretty much all a keyframe is taking these two numbers and letting the computer figure out what are all the numbers for each frame in between. So there we go. We're going to fade in, and we've got the beginning of our animation. Not very exciting, but we can start to see how the basics work. So I'm just going to animate a couple more properties. Let's take a look at our notes and make sure that we're covering everything. I think we're doing pretty good so far. Okay, so we're going to make a shape layer. Okay, so if I'm done with this animation, usually what I will do is go ahead and lock this layer. That means that if I try to click on this or do stuff, nothing will happen. And if I don't lock the layer, if I accidentally click and drag somewhere where I'm trying to do something else, I can mess up this part of the animation. So if I'm done with this part of the animation, I always lock the layer so I don't have to worry about accidentally moving it or doing stuff when I'm working on a different layer. So let's move our composition a little bit forward to when we've already faded in. So I'm going to move this guy up to here. And maybe I'll just do like this 2 seconds. And so we'll work on this next section of our animation. And so let's just bring in some shapes. So I'm going to save. Oh, I haven't saved yet. Whoops. Okay, so I hit Control S. I forgot to save earlier. So let's go ahead and save this document. So I'm going to go into Animation 260. And I'm just going to call this intro.aep. So this is an AEP file. This is like our FLA file, but for After Effects. So I'm just going to save that there. Okay, so now let's add a new layer. So I'm going to move the playhead back here. I'm going to go to Layer and add a new shape layer. And a shape layer is basically just like a blank layer where I can add new content. So I'm going to add some shapes. I'm just going to rename this to be shapes. And I'm going to trim the beginning of the layer to right here because it's not being used before that. And I'm just going to add some shapes. So I have some tools up here. I have different shapes that I can add here. There's also a pen if I want to draw stuff. And there's also text, which we'll do in a second. There's a brush. There's a few other things. You usually don't want to actually be creating your content in After Effects most of the time. The shapes are really for doing effects like masking and other things where we need different types of shapes. But normally you aren't going to actually be drawing your content inside of After Effects. You normally will be doing it in Illustrator or Animate and then adding effects in After Effects. So anyway, let's add a shape. So I'm going to add a star. So if I drag this star, you can see it's kind of like rotating around and doing stuff. And I'm just going to throw it right here. And let's change the fill. Maybe a blue star is nice. And I'm actually just going to get rid of the stroke. I don't really need a stroke for this. So let's change the stroke to 0. And so we've got a star. I'm going to go back to my selection tool. So I'll just hit V. And I'm actually going to animate this across the screen. So I'm going to start it over here where it's not visible. And I'm just going to animate the star moving across the screen. Very, very, very simple. And so to do that, you can see that After Effects has already opened some of the properties for this layer for me. I don't necessarily want these properties, but let's take a look at what's in here. So I'm going to close this again just so we see what this looks like. So if I open the properties here, you can see that my star actually has multiple areas. So the transform is for the whole layer. Okay, so the transform just affects everything in this layer, but I can have more than one shape in the layer. So the contents has this star. And if I add another star, so I'm going to add another star down here, now I have 2 stars. Okay, so the layer actually shows you all of the contents in there, and I can animate different properties for each one of these stars. So if I want to animate the stars together, I would animate the transform. So look when I animate let's do position. Notice that both stars move when I animate the transform. The transform affects everything in this layer. So if I have multiple shapes, it's going to animate multiple shapes. If I want to animate one of the stars, then I have to go into contents. I have the star, and if I select one, it shows me which one I've got selected. And if I open this here, you can see the star has its own transform. So if I open this transform and I animate the position, now I'm just moving that one star. So I don't really like to be this deep into something like this, so I'll actually normally make multiple layers for the different things, so I don't have to like go through all these different steps. But we just want to, see how all of that fits together. So we'll animate that in a second. We also can animate different properties of the star. So I can animate the stroke. I could, let's actually move it on screen here for a second. So let's say I wanted to animate the stroke. I could start with the stroke at 0, and I could animate it up like that. I could animate the fill. So I could animate the fill from one color to another, or I could animate the opacity. I can also change the blending mode. There's like a lot of different stuff I can do with this. So that's where all the properties are, and I can basically keyframe or animate any of these properties. So let's animate our stars separately. Just as an example, as I mentioned, normally this is not really how I would do this. I would normally make separate layers, but let's just show how this would work. So we've got Polystar 1, and I just want to animate it going across the screen. So I'm going to keyframe my position, and then I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And so when I add a keyframe here, we sort of save the position here, and then I'm going to move all the way over here. And then I'm just going to move the star where I want it to go visually. So I'll move it like here. And that should keyframe it. Okay. Although we don't see our nice line. Maybe that's only in layers. We might have to change that. Okay, so there we go. If I want the star to go farther, I can like go to this keyframe here and just move it farther over here. There we go. But normally we would see a little line here. Do you know if that is that only for layers, or do I have to click on something? You know how I should be seeing like a line going across the thing? Yeah, okay. I think that only, maybe that only works on layers, or maybe they changed this. Okay, let's undo this and see. Okay, I'm gonna delete my second polystar, and I'm just gonna animate this with a transform, because this is actually something that we probably want to know. So I'm gonna set my polystar to 0, 0. So it's right in the center of my layer. And then what we should see, so I'm going to move this guy over here. Eh? What?
I was going to say you guys said stop watching.
Oh, yeah, I'm just moving it into place first. Okay, so I'm going to move it here. I'm going to add the keyframe. Oh, but this is another thing to look out for. So I added the keyframe kind of in the middle here because I was playing the animation, and I didn't have the playhead at the beginning of the area. So if I do that by accident, I can just drag the keyframe over here, or I can just undo and drag my playhead back here, and then add my keyframe there. Okay, so now I'm going to move it over here, and now I'm going to move my, there we go, that's what I'm talking about. Okay, so I guess that only happens with layers. So that's another good reason to animate your layers and not your contents of your layers. Okay, so now when I move the position of the star over here, we add in a keyframe here, but we also see a really nice preview of what this animation is doing. And this really only works with position animations because they are, easy to visualize in this way. But you can see now with this position animation, I can see each dot represents a frame. And so you can see if I move this keyframe closer, the dots get farther apart because it's animating over a shorter period of time. If I move it farther away, there's more dots, there's more frames in this animation. Okay, so if we preview that now, the basic path stays the same, but the time is changing. And so those dots are kind of a visualization of that. And I can also move the keyframes themselves. So that's kind of a nice thing with After Effects is I actually can edit the keyframe without changing the playhead. Normally, if I wanted to change a keyframe, I'd have to move the playhead to where I want to change it. But with the position keyframe, I can actually just grab these keyframes visually and move them around. And we can also, well, actually, we're going to go over this later. So for now, let's just stick with this. So now we've got our star moving across our screen. There we go. We can also layer our properties on top of each other. So my star is moving across the screen, but I can animate the rotation as well as the position. So now what I'll do is I'll keyframe the rotation here, and then I'll move over here. And if I want to rotate once, the easy way to do that is just to add this first number and just make that a 1. Okay, so now we have a cool rotating star. If I want to rotate by more than that, I have to go back to this keyframe, and I could do like 10. This is probably going to look kind of ridiculous, but let's see how that goes. Oh, okay, I didn't do that right. What did I miss? Oh, I think it's actually going too fast. Let's see if I do like 11. I think what was happening is it's something weird is happening because it's definitely not rotating 11 times. I think it's going so fast that we're only seeing certain frames. Let's try like oops. Let's try like 4. There we go. Okay, so when I was doing more rotations, it's actually going so fast that it looked like it was only going once, which is kind of cool. Anyway, 4 is probably too many. Let's do 3. Okay, so we've got rotating and moving across the screen at the same time. And we can also do scale. We can really do as many things as we want. Let's increase the scale. So let's start there. Let's go over here. Let's increase the scale by 2. So we'll do 200%. And so now we have this cool rotating star. Morning. And notice that, you know, the properties have different units, right? For opacity, we have percentage. For rotation, we have degrees or numbers of rotation. For scale, we have percentage. For position, we have X and Y numbers. So depending on what you're using, all of the properties have these different values. Okay, so let's make a copy of this, and then we're going to change it a little bit and go over one more thing. So I'm just going to call this, instead of shapes, I'm going to rename this star 1. And I'm going to lock this, and then I'm going to duplicate it. Or maybe I have to unlock it first. Okay, I have to unlock it first. Then I want to duplicate it. Maybe that is up here. And where's duplicate? Edit. Oh, there it is. Okay, duplicate, or Control D if you want to do it faster. Okay, so this star, I'm just gonna move it. So this is kind of tricky to do, but if you want to do this, I can select the keyframes. Is it gonna let me do it? Maybe I have to click. Okay, I can click one keyframe and then click the next one, and then I think I can. There we go. It's kind of tricky, but if you do it right, you can move the whole thing. I'm going to move it down here. And then I can also move the keyframes around. Let's say I wanted this one to go from maybe big to small instead. I can just drag this scale keyframe over here and this one over here. You can really like move these around, add different ones. You can edit the keyframes a lot. And so now we have 2 different stars. And then another thing, the last parameter that we haven't looked at, this is the last thing we'll look at, is this anchor point. The anchor point is where sort of the center of the layer is. And I can move this anchor point. So if I move the anchor point, actually I have to use the anchor point tool. If I move the anchor point, oh, I don't want it to change the position. If I have the anchor point tool selected, it should only change the anchor point. So why isn't it? doing that. Okay, whatever. If we change the anchor point, what you're going to see is that the star is rotating not around the center anymore, but around that anchor point. And the farther we move away with the anchor point, okay, I'm going to turn the position off for a second. Okay, so the farther I move away with that anchor point, it's rotating around that anchor point. And we can animate the anchor point as well, so we can create very complex animations. So I'm going to keyframe this anchor point, and then as we go over here, I'm just going to move the anchor point up a little bit, like that. Or no, let's go this way. And so we'll see the rotation starting to kind of like move away from the center. So those are kind of our main properties. I'm going to stop here. But we're going to continue working after the break. We're going to look at some more complex things we can do with our animation. Oh, we have to add text too, but I'll do that later. I'll give you guys some time to play around with this now.